"Get off the range," the sergeant shouted, his voice cracking with the self-important authority of a man barely 25. "Ma'am, this is a live-fire area. You need to clear out." The woman he addressed didn't flinch. She stood just behind the designated safety line, her shadow a long, still line in the late afternoon sun of the Kandahar province. Her name, according to the flimsy contractor badge clipped to her drab work shirt, was Alara Vance. Her age was indeterminate. Gray threaded the dark hair pulled back in a severe knot, but her posture was as rigid as the steel target stands 1,000 meters downrange. The heat baked the air into a shimmering mirage, distorting the distant targets into wavering specters. She was watching a young private, his face slick with sweat, fail for the third time to qualify on the long-range rifle. His shots went wide, kicking up puffs of ochre dust. Sergeant Diaz sighed, running a hand over his shaved head. "Private Miller, control your breathing. You're jerking the trigger." He turned his irritation back to the woman. "Ma'am, I'm not going to tell you again. This area is off-limits to civilian personnel." Alara's gaze remained fixed downrange. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, weren't just looking. They were dissecting. She saw the inconsistent swirl of the wind, a thermal updraft rising from a sun-baked rock outcrop halfway to the target, and the subtle cant of the private's rifle as he fought his own fatigue. She was a logistics analyst, her file said, a number cruncher, a supply chain specialist sent to optimize the flow of beans, bullets, and bandages. To Sergeant Diaz, she was just another desk jockey, a soft civilian who had no business near the sharp end of the spear. He saw a middle-aged woman in the wrong place. He had no way of knowing he was looking at a predator, momentarily at rest, observing a world she understood more deeply than he ever would. Her stillness was not passivity. It was a state of absolute calculation. And in that moment, she calculated that the young sergeant was a problem she would eventually have to solve. For now, she simply turned and walked away, her boots making no sound on the hard-packed earth. Colonel Marcus Thorne pinched the bridge of his nose, the perpetual headache of command a dull throb behind his eyes. On his desk, under the harsh fluorescent lights of his command container, lay the file for Alara Vance. It was offensively thin. Logistics Analyst GS-14. Contractor, Kestrel Global Solutions Previous Employment. A series of consulting firms with bland, corporate names. No photo. No detailed service record. It was a ghost file sanitized to the point of absurdity. She just arrived on the 1400 transport, his executive officer, Major Chun, supplied. Assigned to the S4 shop to review our supply chain efficiency. Thorne grunted, flipping the single page over as if expecting more information to magically appear. A GS-14 civilian analyst out here? At FOB Kestrel? We're at the edge of the world, Major. The supply chain is what it is. Long, dangerous, and inefficient. I don't need an overpaid consultant to tell me that. I need more helicopter parts and hardened vehicles. He tossed the file onto his desk. It landed with a dismissive flutter. What's her background? Who vetted this? Her clearance is above top secret, sir. The directive came straight from CENTCOM. They were very specific. She is to be given unrestricted access and full cooperation. Thorne leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. He was a man who believed in structure, in rank, in the clear and unambiguous lines of authority. A civilian with a ghost file and a carte blanche from high command felt like a wrench thrown into the gears of his well-oiled machine. He pictured a woman who would complain about the quality of the coffee, question his operational security, and generally be a bureaucratic nuisance. Later that day, he saw her for the first time. She was standing outside the Tactical Operations Center, her hands in the pockets of her cargo pants, watching the evening shift change. She was exactly as he'd pictured, and yet not at all. She was older, yes, but there was an economy to her presence, a lack of wasted motion that was almost unnerving. He decided to address the issue head-on. He strode over, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Ms. Vance, I'm Colonel Thorne." She turned to face him. Her eyes were level, direct. Colonel, her voice was low, without inflection. Welcome to Kestrel, he said, the words a formality devoid of warmth. I've reviewed your file. This brief, he let the word hang in the air. Let me be clear. This is a forward operating base in an active combat zone. We run a tight ship. My people are focused on the mission. Your job is to analyze logistics. I expect you to do that from your assigned office, stay out of restricted areas, and above all, stay out of the way. This is not a corporate retreat. Am I understood? It was a speech he'd given to embedded journalists and visiting politicians. It was designed to establish dominance, to put civilians in their place. Vance held his gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable. There was no defiance in her eyes, but no deference either. It was the look of someone assessing a piece of information. Understood, Colonel, she said. Then she turned her attention back to the soldiers, her quiet observation resuming as if he had never spoken. Thorne was left standing there, feeling strangely dismissed. He had laid down the law, but he had the distinct impression that she was the one who had taken his measure, not the other way around. In the days that followed, Alara became a silent fixture on the base. She did not stay in her office. She walked. Her movements were methodical, purposeful. She began each morning before dawn, tracing the full length of the HESCO barrier perimeter. The guards in the towers grew accustomed to her solitary silhouette moving against the pre-dawn sky. They didn't know she was counting their paces, timing their rotations, noting the slight sag in the concertina wire near the southern wadi, a perfect, shadowed ingress point. She saw the blind spot where the fields of fire from Tower 4 and Tower 5 failed to overlap by less than 3 meters. She took her meals in the main dining facility, always sitting alone at a small table near the exit. But she wasn't just eating. She was listening. The cacophony of soldiers' voices was a data stream. She learned that Sergeant Diaz's squad was cocky but green. She learned that the mechanics in the motor pool were trading MRE heaters for contraband magazines. She learned that a young communications specialist, Corporal Anya Sharma, had the steadiest hands and sharpest ears in the entire TOC, even though she was often talked over by her male superiors. Alara filed away the name and the observation. Her official work was impeccable. She spent 2 hours each day in the S for shop, her fingers flying across the keyboard, untangling logistical knots that had plagued the supply sergeants for months. She rerouted a shipment of critical transmission fluid through a different air corridor, saving 3 days of transit time. She identified a pattern of spoilage in medical supplies and traced it to a faulty refrigeration unit on a transport plane in Bugram. The supply officer was astounded. She delivered results without explanation, her reports concise and brutally efficient. But her real work happened in the TOC. She had the clearance, and Thorne, despite his initial warning, couldn't bar her without cause. She would stand for hours in the back corner, a ghost behind the glowing screens, ostensibly observing the logistical flow under stress. The drone operators and intelligence analysts barely noticed her. They were focused on the pixels, the endless green and black landscapes of the surrounding valleys. Alara saw more. She saw the rhythm of life and death. She watched the patrol patterns of their convoys and the enemy's responses. She noticed a subtle change along Route Viper, a primary supply artery. For 3 consecutive days, a goatherd and his flock appeared on the same ridge overlooking a narrow pass at the exact time the resupply convoy was scheduled to pass. Coincidence was a luxury she didn't believe in. The herder never looked at the convoy. He was too careful. And that, to Alara, was the most dangerous sign of all. She didn't report it. A report was an opinion. She preferred to wait for facts. She logged the time, the coordinates, and the pattern in a small black notebook she kept in her pocket, its pages already filling with her precise, angular script. The alarm was a violent, shrieking sound that cut through the mundane hum of the base. Complex ambush. Route Viper. Convoy 3 Alpha is pinned down. The TOC, which had been a place of bored vigilance moments before, erupted into controlled chaos. Voices overlapped on the comms net, a frantic symphony of contact reports, casualty statuses, and desperate calls for support. Colonel Thorne stood in the center of the room, his face a mask of grim focus, barking orders to redirect an Apache gunship that was 20 minutes out. Too far. Too long. On the main screen, the feed from a Reaper drone showed the situation. 3 MRAPs were trapped in a narrow canyon, the same pass Alara had noted. Puffs of smoke from RPGs blossomed against the canyon walls. Green tracers stitched the air from multiple well-concealed enemy positions. It was a classic L-shaped ambush, perfectly executed. The soldiers in the TOC were doing their jobs, but an edge of panic frayed their professionalism. They were young, most of them on their first combat tour, and their training was being tested by a brutal reality. Alara stood in her usual corner, a pillar of stillness in the swirling storm. Her heart rate remained a steady 60 beats per minute. Her breathing was slow and deep. Panic was a contagion, and she had inoculated herself against it decades ago. While others saw chaos, she saw a geometry problem. Enemy firing positions formed a triangle. The convoy was at the center. The solution was to break one of the triangle's sides. "Where is the sniper?" Thorne demanded, his voice tight. "They're getting picked apart. Someone find that damn sniper." The drone operator, a lance corporal with wide, terrified eyes, zoomed the camera in, sweeping across the ridgeline. "I can't get a fix, sir. The muzzle flash is too sporadic. He's using a suppressor." The radio crackled. "TOC, this is 3 Alpha Actual. Gunner in the lead vehicle is hit. We're taking accurate fire from the high ground, east side. We can't suppress." Then the world went dark. A sudden flash on the screen, followed by static. "Reaper feed is down. I think they shot it down. Sir, we've lost visual," the operator yelled, his voice cracking. The last image burned into Alara's mind. A fractured rock formation on the eastern ridge, shaped vaguely like a claw. The sniper had to be there. It was the only position that offered both cover and a clear line of sight into the MRAP's gunner turret. The pressure in the room became a physical weight. Men were dying, and their comrades in the TOC were now blind, reduced to listening to the sounds of the battle over the radio, helpless. Thorne slammed his fist on the console. "Get me another asset overhead now." The young lieutenant responsible for coordinating fire support was crumbling. He held the radio handset, his knuckles white. "3 Alpha, talk to me. Where is the fire coming from? Give me a direction, a landmark, anything." "Everywhere." The voice on the other end screamed back, laced with terror and the roar of machine gun fire. "We're boxed in. We can't see him." The lieutenant looked at the static-filled screen, then back at his map, his training failing him under the crushing weight of responsibility. He was about to give an order to blanket the entire ridge with mortar fire. A desperate, inaccurate move that would waste precious ammunition and likely miss the sniper entirely. In that moment of critical failure, Alara moved. She didn't run. She flowed through the chaos, an act of silent, deliberate purpose. She placed a firm hand on the lieutenant's shoulder. He flinched, startled, and looked up into her calm, gray eyes. She didn't say a word to him. She simply took the handset from his unresisting fingers. Her voice, when she spoke into the radio, was the antithesis of the panic in the room. It was low, clear, and imbued with an absolute, unshakable certainty that cut through the static and the fear. "Gunner, lead vehicle. This is Vance. Listen to my voice." There was a pause on the other end, then a strained, "Who is this?" We're taking fire." "I know," Alara said, her tone unchanging. "Ignore everything else. Look at the eastern ridge. Do you see the rock formation that looks like a claw?" "Ah, yes. I see it." Hope surged in the soldier's voice. "Your target is 3 meters above the highest point of that rock, 1 meter to the left. There is a cluster of dark desert scrub. He is nested inside it. Put 3 rounds into that bush. Fire for effect. Now." She described a position that had been visible on the drone feed for less than a second before it cut out. A detail no one else had registered. A detail she had committed to memory with photographic precision. There was no hesitation from the convoy. The desperation for a solution was too great. A few seconds later, the distinct, heavy thud of the MRAP's 50 caliber machine gun echoed over the radio, followed by a triumphant shout from the soldier. "Target down. Holy target is down. The fire has stopped. He's down." A wave of stunned silence rolled through the TOC. Every head turned towards Alara. The lieutenant stared at her, his mouth agape. Colonel Thorne looked as if he'd been struck. She had taken command, given a perfect fire correction based on a memory, and saved the lives of the men in that convoy. She held the handset for another moment, listening to the relieved chatter as the ambush broke apart, then calmly placed it back on its cradle. She met Thorne's astonished gaze, offered no explanation, and retreated to her corner, her work done. The quiet logistics analyst had just become the most dangerous person on the base. The official debriefing was a tense affair. The convoy 3 Alpha had been successfully extracted, but not without cost. 2 wounded, 1 MRAP disabled. Colonel Thorne presided over the meeting, his expression a mixture of relief and deep, unsettling curiosity. He went through the timeline of events, his voice clipped and professional. When he got to the point where the drone feed was lost, he paused. "At 15:42 hours, he said, looking directly at Alara, who sat at the back of the room. All visual contact with the engagement area was lost. Shortly thereafter, a civilian contractor, Ms. Vance, issued a direct fire correction to the lead vehicle's gunner, resulting in the neutralization of a key enemy sniper position. He let the statement hang in the air, a formal accusation disguised as a report. Ms. Vance, the floor is yours. Explain how you did that." All eyes were on her. The young lieutenant from the TOC was there, his face a mixture of awe and shame. Sergeant Diaz, whose platoon was on quick reaction force standby, was also present, his usual smirk gone, replaced by a look of intense concentration. He remembered her on the range, the way she had watched, utterly still. Alara's expression was placid. She didn't stand. "There's nothing to explain, Colonel," she said, her voice even. "The sniper's hide was visible on the drone feed before we lost the link. I saw it." "You saw it?" Thorne pressed, incredulous. "The drone was sweeping at 5,000 feet. The operator couldn't isolate the position. You're telling me you pinpointed a camouflaged sniper from a fleeting, high-altitude image?" "Yes," Alara said. "It was not a boast. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same finality as a weather report." A murmur went through the room. The intel analysts exchanged glances. They spent their entire lives staring at those screens. They knew how impossible that was for an untrained eye. Thorne stared at her, searching for a hint of deception, of ego, of anything other than the unnerving calm she projected. He found nothing. She was a black box, an anomaly he could not explain within the rigid framework of his world. "Your intervention was decisive," he finally conceded, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It prevented further casualties. It was as close to a thank you as he was capable of giving." The meeting concluded, but the incident was far from over. As the officers and NCOs filed out, they cast furtive glances at Alara. The whispers had already begun, spreading from the TOC to the barracks, to the chow hall, to the guard towers. The quiet woman from the S4 shop wasn't just a paper pusher. She was something else. Sergeant Diaz walked past her, and for the first time he didn't see a lost civilian. He looked at her with a dawning, fearful respect. The assumptions that had defined her were shattering, replaced by a growing, unnerving legend. Who was Alara Vance? The question hung over FOB Kestrel like the dust, settling on everything. To restore a sense of normalcy and boost morale after the ambush, Colonel Thorne announced a base-wide marksmanship competition. It was part command-mandated fun, part public relations, and part a way for him to reassert control. The best shots from each platoon would compete. Pride was on the line. The day of the competition was clear and hot. The entire off-duty population of the base gathered around the long-range qualification course. Sergeant Diaz, a renowned marksman himself, was running the event, his confidence restored on the familiar ground of the firing line. Alara was there, standing in the same spot she had occupied days before, just behind the line of observers. She watched as the soldiers, the supposed best of the best, took their turns. The target was a standard silhouette at 1,000 meters. The distance was challenging, and the shifting wind played tricks, pushing even well-aimed shots off mark. Diaz himself had posted the best score, a tight grouping in the upper torso of the target. Thorne saw her watching. The mystery of her actions in the TOC still gnawed at him. He saw the whispers and the curious looks directed her way. Part of him wanted to demystify her, to expose her as a fluke. Another, deeper part of him was goaded, challenged by her quiet competence. He made a decision. It was a risk, a public gamble. He strode over to her, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Ms. Vance, since you have such a keen eye for spotting targets, why don't you show these soldiers how it's done?" A hush fell over the crowd. It was an unmistakable challenge, a public call-out meant to put the civilian in her place. Sergeant Diaz grinned, sensing a moment of vindication. This was his world. He stepped forward, a smirk playing on his lips, and held out a heavily modified M110 sniper rifle. "Be my guest, ma'am," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "She's all yours. Watch the recoil." Alara looked at Thorne, then at the rifle. She showed no hesitation, no surprise. She simply walked forward, taking the weapon from Diaz. The crowd murmured. She was actually going to do it. She moved to the empty firing station, the rifle feeling like an extension of her own arm. She didn't immediately drop to the ground. Instead, she stood for a long moment, her eyes closed, feeling the wind on her face, tasting the dust in the air. Then she lay down in the prone position, her movements fluid and economical, a study in practiced efficiency. She adjusted the bipod, settled the stock into her shoulder, and curled her finger around the trigger. She ignored the scope for a moment, her eyes fixed on the distant, shimmering target. Diaz, growing impatient, shouted the words that would echo in his memory for years. "Ma'am, if you're not going to shoot, get off the range." Alara didn't respond. Her world had narrowed to a tiny circle of light. She found the target in the scope, saw the river of mirage flowing left to right. She breathed in, then out, finding the still, silent place between heartbeats, the zero space. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. 1,000 meters away, a cloud of dust kicked up behind the target. A long second passed. The spotter, peering through his high-powered scope, finally spoke, his voice a choked whisper. "Hit, dear God, a hit. Dead center." A wave of disbelief washed over the onlookers. A fluke. It had to be a fluke. Thorne's voice was tight. Again. Alara worked the bolt action with smooth, practiced speed, ejecting the spent casing. She settled back behind the scope. Again the breath. Again the stillness. Again the gentle squeeze. The crack of the rifle echoed across the silent range. This time the spotter screamed. "Impact! Holy!" She split the target post. Everyone rushed to the spotting scopes. It was true. The second round had struck the half-inch thick steel pole holding the target plate, shearing it cleanly in two. The metal silhouette toppled over and disappeared. There was nothing left to shoot at. A complete, stunned silence fell over the range. Sergeant Diaz stared, his mouth hanging open, the condescension wiped from his face and replaced by pure, unadulterated awe. Alara Vance rose to her feet, brushed the dust from her pants, handed the rifle back to the petrified sergeant, and walked away, leaving a legend in her wake. Colonel Thorne sat in his soundproofed command container, the door locked. He held the handset of a secure satellite phone, the connection hissing with encrypted silence. The display read, CENTCOM J3. Directorate of Special Activities. He had pulled every string he had. He needed an answer. "General," Thorne began, his voice strained, "I need to know who you sent me. I have a civilian contractor here, an Alara Vance." As Thorne demanded answers, a different kind of revelation was happening in the quiet twilight of the motor pool. Alara stood by a broken-down Humvee, watching the mechanics work under portable floodlights. A figure detached itself from the shadows. It was Chief Warrant Officer Kenji Tanaka, a man even older than Alara, the base's resident master mechanic and a quiet fixture who had been in country for years. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had seen everything. He stopped a few feet from her, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "The stillness," Kenji said, his voice a low rumble. "And the breathing. I saw you on the range today. I thought it might be you, but I wasn't sure until then. It hasn't changed at all." Alara turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. A flicker of recognition, of a shared and buried past, passed between them. "Kenji," she said. "It wasn't a question. It's been a long time. A lifetime," he agreed, a sad smile touching his lips. "They called you Spectre back then, didn't they? In the bad old days. I was the one who repacked your insertion chutes for that job over the Zagros Mountains." "You always packed a good chute, Kenji," she replied, the corner of her mouth twitching in what might have been a smile. Back in the container, Thorne was listening, his face growing pale. The general on the other end of the line was not pleased. "Colonel, you were not meant to ask that question. You were meant to cooperate. Alara Vance is a cover designation for a deeply compartmented asset. Her real name is sealed under the Phoenix Directive." "The Phoenix Directive?" Thorne breathed. It was a myth, a ghost story whispered about in high-level intelligence circles. A program for operators so deep, so burned, that they were officially erased from existence but kept on a phantom roster for impossible situations. "She is not a logistics analyst, Colonel." The general's voice was grim, final. "She is the logistics. When a supply line is unbreakable, when an asset is unrecoverable, when a situation is unsalvageable, we send her. She doesn't follow the book. She wrote half the chapters on unconventional warfare and deep infiltration you were taught at the War College. You do not direct her. You do not question her. You listen to her. And you thank whatever God you pray to that she is on your side. Do you understand me, Colonel? You have Spectre on your base." The line went dead. Thorne slowly placed the handset back in its cradle. The world had just been fundamentally reordered. The woman he had dismissed, the civilian he had tried to intimidate, was a living legend, a ghost who had walked out of the shadows of history and onto his patch of dirt. He was not her commander. He was, at best, her temporary custodian. The next morning, the sun rose over FOB Kestrel, casting long shadows across the dusty parade ground. Sergeant Diaz was drilling his squad, their movements sluggish in the early heat. He was trying to instill discipline, to get their minds back on track after the unsettling events of the previous day. Then he saw her. Alara Vance was walking across the open ground, heading toward the perimeter fence. She moved with the same unhurried, purposeful stride as always. But today, something was different. The entire base saw her through new eyes. Diaz's drill sergeant barked commands died in his throat. He watched her approach. She was just a woman in cargo pants and a plain shirt, but he now saw the ghost of 1,000 untold stories swirling around her. He saw the sniper round that saved a convoy. He saw the impossible shot that broke a target and shattered his arrogance. He froze. Then, acting on an instinct deeper than any regulation, he snapped his body to attention, his back ramrod straight. "Squad!" he roared, his voice sharp and clear. "Attend tie-in." His young soldiers, confused for a second, followed his command, their boots slamming onto the hard earth in a single unified sound. As Alara walked past their formation, Sergeant Diaz executed the sharpest, most profound salute of his life. It was a gesture of absolute, unconditional respect, offered not to a rank or a uniform, but to the woman herself. His squad, following his lead, mirrored the action. It was a breach of protocol. You don't salute civilians. But in that moment, no one cared about protocol. They were saluting a warrior. Alara did not break her stride. She did not offer a verbal reply. But as she drew level with Diaz, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of her head. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance of the gesture. and it was more than enough. Later that day, Colonel Thorne found her standing by the southern perimeter, looking out at the wadi she had identified on her first day. He walked up and stood beside her, forgoing the usual formalities. He didn't salute. That would be too public, too disruptive to the order he was trying to maintain. Instead, he chose a different kind of deference. "The western perimeter," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The blind spot near the wadi, between towers 4 and 5. You saw it, didn't you?" Alara's gaze didn't waver from the distant hills. "Yes," she said. "My engineers are reinforcing it this afternoon. New sensors, overlapping fields of fire." He paused, then turned his head to look at her. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, humbled respect. "Thank you." The thanks was not just for the tactical tip. It was for the lesson. It was an apology. It was his salute. Alara simply nodded again, her eyes still scanning the terrain, ever watchful. As dusk settled, painting the sky in strokes of bruised purple and fiery orange, Alara stood alone on the newly reinforced perimeter wall. The frantic energy of the base had subsided into the steady rhythm of the night shift. The air grew cool, carrying the scent of diesel and distant wood smoke. She was no longer just an observer. She was a guardian. The soldiers in the towers now tracked her movements not with suspicion, but with a protective reverence. The whispers had solidified into a quiet, unshakable truth. Spectre was on the wall. From a worn leather pouch on her belt, she produced a pair of old, heavily battered binoculars. They were not military issue. The black paint was worn down to the bare metal in places, and one of the objective lenses had a small, star-shaped crack near the edge. They were her own, a tool she had carried through countless other twilights in countless other forgotten places. She took a soft cloth and began to clean the lenses with a slow, meticulous motion. It was a ritual, a moment of quiet communion with the tools of her true trade. The setting sun caught the polished glass, making it glint like a distant star. The light reflected in her gray eyes, revealing a depth of experience that no file could ever capture. She raised the binoculars, her arms steady, her body a statue of vigilance against the fading light. She scanned the horizon, her focus absolute. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. She was simply looking. She was watching the shadows lengthen in the valleys, observing the flight of a nocturnal bird, noting the distant flicker of a shepherd's fire. She was reading the landscape, a language she understood better than any other. She was not a soldier anymore, not by name or rank. Her war was supposed to be over, but the duty remained, etched into her soul. She was here to make sure the supplies arrived, that the blind spots were covered, that the young soldiers who reminded her of ghosts from her past made it home. Her presence had brought a new kind of order to FOB Kestrel, an order based not on shouted commands but on quiet, undeniable competence. The respect she had earned was silent and profound. Her dignity was her own, forged in fire and shadow, and here, at the edge of the world, it remained perfectly intact. She was Spectre, and she was on watch.